Good day, everyone. My name is Njoki Chijoke Philip, and in this presentation, I'll be discussing the penetration testing assessment carried out on a Metasploitable 2 virtual machine. I will explain how the assessment was conducted, discuss the vulnerabilities identified using different security testing tools, assess the associated risks, and explain the mitigation and system hardening measures developed from those findings. I will also evaluate the effectiveness of the changes implemented. Part A, I began by defining the scope, objectives, and methodology of the penetration test. The assessment was conducted in a controlled laboratory environment using Kali Linux as the testing machine and Metasploitable 2 as the intentionally vulnerable target. The testing process involved confirming connectivity, performing reconnaissance and vulnerability assessment, analyzing the findings, identifying security gaps, and developing appropriate countermeasures. According to the NIST Special Publication 800-115, security testing should be properly planned and conducted, with the results analyzed to support appropriate mitigation. This approach was followed throughout the assessment. If a testing failure occurred, I would investigate the cause by checking connectivity configuration and tool settings, correct the issue where necessary, repeat the affected test, and document the outcome. Part B, I then performed the vulnerability assessment using Nmap, Nikto, OWASP, and the Nexus result from topic 5. Each tool provided a different perspective of the target. Nmap was used to identify exposed ports and services. Nikto to examine the web server for potential weaknesses. OWASP to assess the web application, and Nexus to provide border vulnerability information. According to the OWASP Web Security Testing Guide, security testing should be systematic and should consider the application's attack surface and security controls. Therefore, the result from these tools should be considered together rather than treated as isolated alerts. In this presentation, I attached the findings analysis in the slide that I created. I also attached the vulnerability and the severity of the vulnerability and the services relevant in the slide created. Also, screenshots of the Nmap, Nikto, OWASP, and Nexus scan was also embedded in the slide. Part C, I then used the findings from Part B to conduct a risk assessment gap analysis. This involves identifying the vulnerabilities, determining their potential impact, identifying weaknesses in existing security controls, and prioritizing associated risks. For example, I inserted the findings, I inserted the risk analysis level, I inserted the gap analysis, I inserted the inadequate control. The same approach was applied to other significant findings. According to NIST's 2024 Cybersecurity Framework, cybersecurity's risk should be understood, assessed, prioritized, and communicated so that appropriate action can be taken. I applied this principle by using the scan result to identify the most significant risk and determine which security gaps required attention. These findings also need to be considered against current security trends. Vulnerable or misconfigured services, weaknesses in which applications Inadequate authentication and unaddressed vulnerabilities continue to create opportunities for compromise. This makes vulnerability management and attack surface reduction important. According to the OWASP Web Security Testing Guide, identifying the application's attack surface and systematically evaluating its security controls are important parts of security testing. Therefore, the findings were considered according to their wider security impact rather than simply reported as scanner alerts. Based on this assessment, the proposed countermeasures was that I created a unique password. I changed the Metasploitable2 password to a unique password. I created a unique password for that, and I also disable unnecessary FTP port 2021. The third one was I disabled Telnet port 23. These were selected according to the severity and potential impact of the vulnerabilities, as well as their feasible and relevance to the target system. The expected outcome was to reduce the attack surface, strengthen the affected controls, and reduce the likelihood or impact of exploitation. I also created a risk assessment screenshot which is added in the slide. My findings, my risk level, my security gaps, everything was added in the slide. Part D, the next stage involved implementing at least 3 of the proposed security changes on Metasploitable2. I first assessed the system using the required MSF admin account and then implemented the selected hardening measures. Each change was linked directly to a vulnerability or security gap identified during the earlier assessment. Also, I attached the login phase of the Metasploitable2. I also attached more actual hardening changes that was done, and the evidence of hardening changes that was implemented. All these changes was added on the slide. The purpose of this stage was to demonstrate that the vulnerabilities identified during testing could be translated into practical security improvement. Part E, finally, I evaluated the selected changes by considering their critical feasibility or expedience and associated costs or resources. Every change is made from level 1 to level 2 to level 3 was attached, and also the actual vulnerabilities was attached, and also I attached the expected result. After implementation, the actual result was inserted. I compared this with the expected outcome to determine whether the mitigation achieved its intended purpose. And with my findings, the result met the required expectation. Any remaining vulnerability or difference between the expected and actual result would indicate that further investigation and additional mitigation may be required. Overall, this assessment demonstrates that penetration testing is not simply about discovering vulnerabilities. It involves planning the assessment, gathering and analyzing evidence, assessing risk, identifying security gaps, selecting appropriate countermeasures, implementing those measures, and validating their effectiveness. The SCAN findings therefore inform the risk assessment. The risk assessment informed the hardening strategy, and the final result provided evidence of whether the implemented measures reduced the identified risk. I also attached the result and lesson learned. Brief, and which the lesson learned is that it's always good to implement system hardening and implement, update, and patch outdated softwares to make security smoothly. Thank you for listening to my presentation. My reference will be added at the end of the slide. Thank you.